Okay, we're going to learn about trig graphs. It's either a sine or a cosine. This one happens to be a sine. Again, I usually graph sketch it and then label the axis. It's a sine. A sine normally would go something like this, but it has a negative in front of it. Do you see this negative? So that doesn't mean, it means it doesn't start upwards. It flips it over the x-axis. So it goes down and then up. And again, notice I sketched it before I labeled it. Now I'm going to label it. We already know that in the form of y equals a sine bx, if you want it all, it's minus c plus d, which is what we'll use for the phase shift. But right now we only need the b. So I'm going to get rid of that, pretend it's not there. And what is the amplitude? It is the absolute value of A. So in this case, the A is a -1. Absolute value of -1 makes the amplitude a 1. Are there any questions on that? Now, what is the period? The period is how far it goes before it starts repeating. And it's 2 pi over B. 2 pi over, what's b on this one? 2/3. To divide a fraction, you divide by a fraction, you multiply by its reciprocal or stay, change, flip. I believe these 2's could cancel, and that makes my period 3 pi. So this is 3 pi. I hope everybody watches because this can be a little tricky. Half of 3 pi is 3. You can take half the top or double the bottom. 3 pi over 2. Again, let's do half of that. Doubling the bottom again makes it 3 pi over 4. So what we're doing is we're counting by 3/4. 0/4 pi, 3/4 pi, 6/4 pi. What do you think would go here if I added another 3/4? 9/4 pi. That's what makes these pretty hard. And add another 3/4 would give me 12/4. What is 12/4? 3. So you counted by 3/4 pi, which can be challenging. Now, once I have that, I think I should be able to label my extremas. What is this maximum here? It would be 9 pi over 4 comma 1, and this minimum would be 3 pi over 4 comma -1. Okay, we're going to go to 21. So let's see what we have here. This one looks to be a phase shift. So I'm going to set this up. Find your amplitude, find your period, just like normal. It's A sine bx minus c, and then there might be a vertical shift, but this does not have one. So the amplitude is the absolute value of A. So for this one, it's the absolute value of 3. That makes your amplitude 3. What is the period? Period for sine and cosine will always be 2 pi over b. 2 pi over, what's b on this case? 2. So that makes your period pi. So I have my period, I have my amplitude. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch a sine wave. A sine wave starts at the origin. Please notice that I'm doing it dotted because I know I have to shift it. But I can label my amplitude. Should be 3. And I can label my period, pi. Half of it would be half pi. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. So I counted by fourths. Now this does continue. So let's say it continued this way. Where would this point be? Would that be 5/4? Would that be 6/4, which is 3/2? Remember, you're adding 1/4. Same thing down here. It does continue, right? So if I do, this would be a negative pi over 4, a negative pi over 2, I think that, and this. Anyway, I just extended it because I know I have to shift my actual graph. What value makes this part inside here equal 0? 2x minus pi equals 0. Add the pi over, divide by 2. Because it's positive, that means it shifts that far to the right. So I need to move everything pi over 2 to the right. Do you see this point right here? Move it pi over 2 to the right, where would it be? Take this, move it pi over 2 to the right. Right? Take this, move it pi over 2 to the right. Take this one, move it pi over 2 to the right. Take this, am I wrong? And take this, where am I? Take this one, move it, take that one right there, move it pi over 2 to the right. And it would come down at pi. So this is the graph that I'm looking for. And can you label the maxes and mins? This would be 3 pi over 4 comma 3. This would be pi over 4 negative 3. And again, what makes this one hard is I believe that you have to have a phase shift, which means moving it, shifting it left or right. Okay, number 25 is a sine wave. So I'm going to sketch it. It's going to start at the origin like all sine waves do. However, it may not be eventually, because it's going to have a phase shift. Because most sine waves start upward, but because it's a negative, it's going to come down and then back up. The period is the absolute value, the amplitude is the absolute value of A. So what would that be? The absolute value of negative 2. So that makes the amplitude 2. So it goes 2 and negative 2. The period is 2 pi over B. 2 pi over what is B? Remember, it is A sine BX. So the B is a 2. So that makes the period pi. So that's pi, that's half pi, that's a 1/4 pi, that's 3/4 pi. Now if I was to extend this, because I know I do have to shift it, and by the way, let's do it smart. So let's go ahead and say, what makes this 0? 2x plus pi over 2, let me write it over here, 2x plus pi over 2 equals 0. Subtract pi over 2, and I think it would be a negative. Multiply by 1/2, and that would give me x equaling negative pi over 4. Because it's negative means you're shifting it to the left. So I need everything to move to the left pi over 4. With that in mind, I might extend this to the right because I know I have to move it to the left. So if I was to label these, 3/4, 4/4, 5/4, 5/4, 6/4, which could be 3/2, right? Anyway, I want to move everything pi over 4 to the left. So what is it going to do? You move pi over, if I take this right here and I move it pi over 4 to the left, would it be here? If I take this and I move pi over 4 to the left, would it be here? And if I took that one and that one, moved pi over 4 to the left. If I take this one and I move it pi over 4 to the left, where would it be? Instead of 3/4, it would be at 2/4, right? Which is 1/2 pi. So I believe it does something like this. How about if you move this to the left pi over 4? It would be here. And if you move this to the left, right here, 5/4 to the left, pi over 4, where would it be? Pi? 5/4 minus 1/4 would be 4/4. And so you have these points. This is a maximum at pi over 2 comma 2. You have a couple of minimums. I don't care which one you give me. But I probably will ask for a max and min labeled. You'll notice that the real graph is the blue one. The dotted one is just helping me to get to the blue one. Again, these are very difficult because they involve phase shifts. Okay, after 25, we're going to go to 27. 27 is a sine wave. So I'm going to sketch a sine wave. Starts at the origin, comes down, and then back up. Amplitude is 3, so I mark it 3 and -3. Period is 2 pi over b. What is the b? Pi. So 2 pi over pi makes the period 2. That's 2, that's 1, that's 1/2. 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, right? So we had 0 halves, 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, which is the 2, right? Now, what makes this 0 on the inside? If I was to take the part inside the parentheses, pi x plus 2 and make it equal 0. Subtract 2 and divide by pi, right? I'm sorry, is this right? Hang on one second. What is it? Yeah, divide by pi. Hold on one second. If you subtract 2 and divide by pi, you'd have -2 over pi, right? Now, when the period doesn't have pi, but I'm shifting with pi, it's not going to make sense. So I don't know how you want me to do it. That means it's moved to the left. This is a question I would not ask on a quiz. If this is at 0 and I might move it 2 over pi to the left, would that be at -2 over pi? If this is 1/2 and I may move it 2 over pi to the left, would it be at 1/2 minus 2 over pi, comma 3? To me, that's not a reasonable question. If you don't mind, I think we're going to skip this or omit it. Maybe the other one, 29, let's see. Give me a moment. We're going to look at the other ones too. But right now, I'm going to say let's omit number 27. Because to me, it's not really a fair question. Now on 29, you'll notice it is a sine wave, but a negative sine wave. So instead of sine wave going up, it's going to be a sine wave going downward, right? So I do my sine wave. I make my amplitude 2. Thank you. So I make my amplitude is the absolute value of A. Again, A sine bx. Absolute value of A is the absolute value of 2, so that makes the amplitude 2. And the period, please notice, is 2 pi over b. What's b? 2 pi over 2 pi makes the period 1, right? So that's 1, 1/2, 1/4, I believe. 1/4 and 3/4. Again, we'd count 0/4, 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4, which is the 1 here. Now, if I do my phase shift, please notice what makes this part inside the absolute value, inside the parentheses, what makes that 0? You have 2 pi x, let me write it over here, 2 pi x plus 4 pi equals 0. 2 pi x, I'd subtract the 4 pi. Then I'd have to divide by what? 2 pi. And what do I end up with? -2. That means it's going to move 2 to the left. Now this one, you'll notice the period has integers, no pi's, and my phase shift has no pi's? This is a fine question. This previous one, I think they made a mistake when they wrote it. I think it was supposed to be plus pi over 2 or something else here. So I do not believe 27 is a valid question. 29 is. I need to move everything to 2 to the left. Well, it's a little hard to move everything 2 when I only went to 1. So maybe I should extend it. And again, I'm moving this way to the right because I know I'm going to have to move it eventually to the left. So, would you agree if that's 1, this would be 2? And halfway, that's 1/2, that'd be 1.5. Again, 0 force 1, force 2, force 3, force 4, force 5, force 6, force, which is 3/2, 7 force, and 8 force is 2, right? So I think that's 5 force, and I think this would have been what? 7 force? Anyway, at this point, let's move everything 2 to the left. Let me get another color so it's have my final graph in a different one. Okay, move this 2 to the left. Would it be at the origin? Yes? What was this doing over here to the right of 2? Was it going downward? So what do you think this blue one's going to have to do? Go downward. So it's probably going to go pretty much just like this. Whoops, let me go back. Get a good color here. Go down. I believe moving it 2 over puts it in the exact same place it started with. So what would be this coordinate? 1/4 -2. This coordinate would be 3/4, comma, +2. Again, we could graph it on our graphing calculator and check it. If you don't trust me, please punch it in, check your values, but I believe this is what it should be. Okay, we've done a few signs. Now let's do a cosine like number 45. Cosines do not start at the origin. Let me redo this a little bit just so I have a little room. Cosines do not start at the origin. Cosines start at the maximum. They come down and then back up. Do you agree that the amplitude is 3? The period is 2 pi over what's b? 2 pi over 2, so the period is pi. So that's 1 pi, that's a 1/2 pi, that's 1/2 of a 1/2 or a 1/4 pi, and that would be 3/4 pi. Again, 0 force, 1/4, 2 force, 3 force, 4 force. And if I was to continue this down, where would that meet at? Negative pi over 4. And anyway, let's take what's inside of here and make inside the parentheses, make it equal 0. 2x minus pi equals 0. Add the pi over and divide by 2. Because it's positive means it's moving to the right. So I need to move everything pi over 2 to the right. So again, I'm going to extend it to the left so that I can move it to the right. So if that was pi over 4, I think this would have been negative pi over 2, just like this was pi over 2, right? Anyway, we want to move everything pi over 2 to the right. Do you see this point? If you move it pi over 2 to the right, where is it going to be? Is it going to be here? If I take this point and I move it pi over 2 to the right, where is it going to be? Right here? If I take this point and I move it pi over 2 to the right, where will it be? Here? So I believe it's not a line, it's a curve. I believe it's going to look something like this. So what's this maximum? Pi over 2 comma 3, because it does go up to 3. This would be pi negative 3 as a minimum, or 0 negative 3 was a minimum. So it's just like a sine wave, but it's cosine. It just starts in a different position. You can always turn a sine into a cosine or vice versa just by using a proper phase shift.